Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite authors, Guy Gavriel Kay. I'm going to give you an overview of his 16 novels and then some reading advice. Kay is one of those fantasy authors where it's harder to figure out where to start. A lot of authors it's easy. Robert Jordan up here, he has a huge series. You start at the beginning. Some other authors may have shorter series, so it's easy to just start at this book one or that book one. However, with Kay, 16 novels, 11 of them are standalones. He also has a duology and a trilogy, so there are lots of options as to where to start. So what I'm going to do is do an overview of the 16 novels of Kay, and then I'm going to give you some reading advice. And when I give the reading advice, I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm going to break Kay's works into 3 different categories. And I'm going to look at the 3 different categories separately, give you reading advice within those categories, and then talk about how you can mix those things together. And then at the end, we'll zoom back out and we'll look at my 2 favorite entry points into his works, and then shorter lists. If you don't want to read all 16 books by Kay, which you should, but if you don't want to read that many and commit to that many, I'm going to give you a 4-book list and an 8-book list. So before I give you the overview of the 16 novels, which I'm going to lay out in publication order, I think 99% of authors, you could read publication order and you would be perfectly fine. But I think Kay is in that 1% where reading publication order is not the best advice as far as how to experience his works. 3 reasons. Number 1, I already mentioned, Kay has 16 novels, 11 of them are standalones. So that is kind of what he does. He kind of does standalones. So it makes more sense to jump into one of his standalones rather than starting with his first book, which is book 1 of his only trilogy. Second reason, I do feel that when you start an author, or you start a genre, or you just start something, that you probably want to start with something that is representative of that author. And most of Kay's works have been described by a critic as historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastical. And that's a description that Kay himself embraces. Well, the first book of Kay's output is traditional fantasy, so it's not really indicative of what he does as an author. It's not representative of what he does as an author. So that's another reason why I wouldn't suggest starting with The Summer Tree. Third reason, in my opinion of Kay's 16 novels, I think The Summer Tree is his weakest book. And I would hate for someone to only read one book by Kay and it be one of his lowest rated books by most people. There are so many great entry points that are better books, and I think Summer Tree and The Fiona of Our Tapestry is still good, and you can read it later, but I wouldn't start there. All right, disclaimers aside, let's look at the books. Kay started his career with the publication of The Fiona of Our Tapestry, a trilogy consisting of The Summer Tree, The Wandering Fire, and The Darkest Road. This is traditional fantasy. It's a portal fantasy with students from the University of Toronto that end up in this other world called Fionavar. But this is not the Tolkien-derived type of fantasy that a lot of authors were writing in the 1980s. Kay instead leans upon history and folklore and myth, and it gives you a different brand of fantasy, although it can't be mistaken for anything else but very traditional kind of fantasy storytelling. It does feel a bit different than a lot of the things that were being written at the time. Now, I already mentioned that The Summer Tree is, in my opinion, Kay's weakest book. But it kind of finds its legs about halfway through, and in this trilogy in particular, you kind of see Kay gain strength as he writes these 3 books, as each book got better for me, and by the end, it was a series that I really enjoyed and I look forward to rereading at some point. Kay's next book is the book that he's probably most known for, and that is Tigana, which was published in 1990. Tigana is the first of these standalones that are historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastical, although I would say with Tigana it's maybe more of a half turn than a quarter turn, because with Kay, he doesn't do a lot of magic in a lot of his works, but Tigana, there is a lot more magic than what would follow. In Tigana in particular, the main concept of the entire story is magically based. So because of that, I'd say this is more of a quarter turn towards the fantastical than a half turn. Tigana is based in Renaissance Italy, and that's when you see people talk about the historical influences on his books. That's what Kay does. He takes a time and place in the world, and he bases his world on it. Sometimes he bases characters on it. Sometimes he even uses events from those times, and just kind of does this in his own otherworldly world. And it almost feels like a riff or an echo of what would happen. Now, it's not called Italy. It doesn't look like it on the map, but it's Renaissance Italy inspired. Tagana is a great book, but I don't think that it's one of Kay's best, and I don't think it's a great entry point. It could be an entry point. I don't think it's the best entry point. It's probably somewhere in the middle, maybe even the top half, but Tagana, even though it has the most name recognition of Kay's works, isn't as good as some of these other ones that will follow it. Kay's next book is A Song for Arbonne, published in 1992. This is another standalone, and this is another one where Kay bases in the real world. This is based in the area of France, Provence, and has to deal with two different nations that are at odds with one another. We have this nation up north that is kind of patriarchal and militaristic, and then we have in the south, Arbonne, this nation full of beauty. It's matriarchal in nature. It has courtly love and troubadours, and it elevates the arts like poetry and music. And you see this story evolve through one of the best characters that Kay has created. His character Blaise is the central protagonist of this story. And one of the treats in this story is seeing Blaise, who's from the north, scoff at what life is like in the south. And he doesn't think that all of these ideals that Arbonne holds dear are important. And then he starts to grow. This book has everything. It has some great action sequences. There are some great relationships. There's some great intrigues, political, familial intrigues. It really has its all. It's an incredible book, and it's my favorite book of Guy Gavriel Kay's, and probably one of the best entry points as well. Kay's next book was The Lions of Al-Rassan, published in 1995. Lions of Al-Rassan is heavily influenced by medieval Spain. In fact, if you look at the map, you'll probably laugh because it looks exactly like Spain with the bits of North Africa and everything. So you see Spain in this story, and you see a character that's reminiscent of El Cid, but you get a story that is wholly Kay's own. And in this story, you get absolutely everything that Kay does best. You get some of the best world building. And the world building here would linger later into Kay's works. This is the first book that Kay wrote that I would call part of his Sarantine world, and that's how I'm going to refer to it in this video. And you see the three different religions portrayed by three different people in here. You get a great found family. You get a cinematic sequence at the end that's incredible. And you get the most unique handling of a climax and falling action as I've read in this genre. Lions of Al-Rassan is another one that is one of Kay's best and is another great entry point, which I'll talk about later in this video. Kay's incredible streak continued with the publication of the Sarantine Mosaic, which is a duology consisting of Sailing to Sarantium, published in 1998, and Lord of Emperors, published in 2000. This is based kind of in the Mediterranean area of Kay's secondary world, and Sarantium is essentially Constantinople. One of the most remarkable things about this story is that Kay tells about a very important sequence of events that happen in the Sarantine Empire. But he rarely gives you the perspective of the important people to these events, the people that the history books will write about. Instead, he tells you the story from the perspective of the smaller people in the tale. He gives you the perspective of chariot racers and a dancer and a doctor, and at the center of it all, a mosaicist, an artisan called to Sarantium to create a great mosaic. It's a remarkable feat of storytelling, and it continued Kay's streak of just remarkable books with 4 in a row that are top-tier fantasy, according to probably most readers that would read them. Kay's next book is The Last Light of the Sun, published in 2004, and this is Kay's Viking tale. This is in the same world as the Sarantine Mosaic and the Lions of Al-Rassan, but it is up in the British Isles area of this world, and you get a Viking tale, and you get a little bit more magic in here. I read this one before I had read any of his traditional fantasy stories, and I found that his inclusion of fairy magic was one of the most notable and interesting and delightful parts of this story. Now, admittedly, The Last Light of the Sun is probably a step below the previous 4 novels that I just mentioned. And because of that, it's probably not as talked about, but I do think it's a bit underrated. I really enjoyed it. It's one of those books that it just took a while for the story to emerge. And then once the story emerged, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed a lot of the aspects of it. But it's probably not top tier K, but if you're looking for a great Viking tale, Last Light of the Sun is probably something that you would enjoy. Kay's next book is Isabel, published in 2007. This is a book that I feel is maybe a little unfairly maligned, but I understand why. I'll give you a few more details when we talk about the reading advice later in this video. But Isabel is different than everything that had preceded it in that it's a traditional fantasy story. And it's a traditional fantasy story that's low fantasy. It's set in our world, basically modern time, has a teenage protagonist, and has a lot of magical tie-ins in this story that takes place in Provence. And I really enjoyed it. There's a big reason why I think when you read this book may determine your level of enjoyment about it. So when I get to the reading advice later in this video, hopefully that'll be of some use to you when to read Isabel, because I think it's a great book. I think it's maybe not top tier Kay, but I think it's a lot better than most people think when they talk about Isabel. Kay's next two books can be linked in some ways because they do share a new setting. And this is Under Heaven, published in 2010, and River of Stars, published in 2013. And these are Eastern settings. These two books are based on two different dynasties in China. And they're very different than anything else that preceded it. And they do go pretty well together, although there is a gap of at least 100 years between the two books. And Under Heaven, in many ways, is Kay's most underrated book. If you told me you'd read everything by Guy Gavriel Kay and Under Heaven is your favorite, I wouldn't argue with you. I think it's that strong of a book. And I don't see it mentioned nearly as much as Lions, Arbonne, Sarantine Mosaic, or even Tagana. But Under Heaven is one of Kay's best. It's one of those tales that has a central protagonist that, because of events, finds himself very important in the grand scheme of this world. And you get to see some great political maneuvering and things like that as he's kind of learning how to do this, because this was not going to be his path. It's a highly memorable story. It's a remarkable story. And it's definitely not one to sleep on. Under Heaven is great. Definitely recommend it. Now, River of Stars is admittedly not up to the level of Under Heaven, in my opinion. However, it has one of those gut punches of an ending that Kay is so great about. In fact, if there's one thing in common with probably all 16 of Guy Gavriel Kay's books, is that he knows how to write an ending. And the ending of River of Stars just hit me like a ton of bricks. Much like The Last Light of the Sun, however, I felt that the story itself took a while to emerge what Kay was trying to say. But when it got there and the ultimate conclusion, I find very, very memorable. And I look forward to rereading it probably as much as any of these other works of Kay, because I do know the ending, and maybe I'll see a little bit more in the journey this time around. But Under Heaven and River of Stars are two great ones in Kay's works if you're looking for something that's maybe a little bit different because of the Eastern-inspired setting. Now, the next three books can be considered together a very loosely related trilogy of standalone novels. Starting with Children of Earth and Sky, published in 2016, A Brightness Long Ago, published in 2019, and All the Seas of the World, published in 2022. Now, these are kind of linked in many ways. Do not think of them as a trilogy, but Children of Earth and Sky came first, and then he wrote A Brightness Long Ago, which is literally a prequel to Children of Earth and Sky. And then he wrote All the Seas in the World, which is a sequel to Children of Earth and Sky. So he didn't write them in order, but they do come together. There are characters that are shared in the three books. And I think, although I consider A Brightness Long Ago one of my favorites, probably my second or third favorite book by this author, I think that the other two books benefit from having read that one. So I do feel that these three books do go well together. So even though these are standalones, I wouldn't, for instance, just pick up Children of Earth and Sky. I think if you read Brightness Long Ago, you're going to get a lot more out of that book. Same thing with All the Seas of the World. And Kay's latest book is Written on the Dark, published in 2025. This, in many ways, as I reflect upon it, almost feels like a coda to the books in the Sarantine world. As you see when I do the sub-categories here in just a minute in this video, this is the latest book in that world, and in many ways it almost feels like a farewell to that world. I say a coda. As a musician, I always think of the coda, the tail end of a piece, the smaller section at the end of a grand work. That's kind of what this book is. It's one of Kay's shortest novels, and it's a very focused story, so I think it's a really great one to read because it doesn't have any fat. It's a very, very focused and very lean storytelling. But at the end, in the epilogue, he harkens back to a few of the other books. So in many ways, it feels like his swan song or his farewell to this world. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of what it felt like to me. Admittedly, it's not one of Kay's strongest books, but it's still great. I still felt emotional at the end, and I still really enjoyed my time with it. Okay, what we're going to do next is we're going to take all of Kay's books and we're going to put them into 3 different categories and look at some reading advice based on those 3 categories. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and break all of these books apart into 3 different categories. So the first grouping is an easy one, and that's putting all of the books in the Sarantine world together. So you have The Lions of Alrazan, the 2 books of the Sarantine Mosaic, Last Light of the Sun, the 3 books that are kind of linked together, Children of Earth and Sky, Brightness Long Ago, All the Seas of the World, and then the latest one, Written on the Dark. So let's go ahead and look at just the Sarantine books a little more detailed and just look at some different ways that we could read these. So I'm going to make a couple little changes here. So first of all, I want to switch Brightness Long Ago and Children of Earth and Sky. As I mentioned before in the overview, Brightness Long Ago is a prequel, even though it was written second. And Children of Earth and Sky has an important character from Brightness that would kind of ruin some of the suspense of Brightness. So I was told to switch those 2 books when I read them, and I'm glad I did because I think it really worked really well. So you see the way I've kind of just put these spatially across the screen. Lions of Alrazan is the entry point into the Sarantine world. I would say that the duology, the Sarantine Mosaic, is absolutely essential. And then the others could be optional. Last Light of the Sun stands alone. The 3 books grouped together with a different order work real well together, and then Written on the Dark as its own thing. So just kind of a different way to look at the Sarantine world if you don't want to read all 8 of those. So the second subset that I want to do of the remaining books is to put the 4 books that are more traditional fantasy together. So those 4 books are the 3 books of the Fiona of Our Tapestry and then Isabel. So let's go ahead and look at these just a little more detailed. And this is the only kind of subcategory here where I think there's only one option. And the only option here is to read these in order. The Fiona of Our Tapestry, obviously it's a trilogy. You have to read book 1, book 2, book 3 in that order. I mentioned in the overview about Isabel how I feel in many ways it's kind of unfairly maligned, I guess. And I feel that with Isabel, if you read it after the Fiona of Our Tapestry, it enhances the enjoyment of that book. There are 2 characters from the Fiona of Our Tapestry that find themselves into Isabel. And I think if you hadn't read that trilogy first, didn't know about the characters, didn't know their backstory, didn't know their capabilities, the impact of their being in the story, I think, would have been lessened. So I think Isabel works really well reading it almost as kind of a 4th book of the Fiona of Our Tapestry, even if it's not a traditional fantasy, but it's a work of low fantasy set in kind of modern-day Provence. So the third subcategory is one that I'm just calling outliers. And these are not outliers in style. Really, the fantasy books would be the stylistic outliers for Kay, but these are the outliers that are not in the Sarantine world. So we have Tigana, A Song for Arbonne, Under Heaven, and River of Stars. Now, I think a case could be made that Under Heaven and River of Stars could potentially be in the Sarantine world. However, they're on the other side of the globe. They're on a different continent. They don't really feel like they belong in that Sarantine world, so I think they work better here. So to just expand these 4 and look at these outlier books, Tigana and Song for Arbonne are definitely standalones. And then Under Heaven and River of Stars, they're not linked, but they are the same setting. So you can read those together. I would not read River of Stars before Under Heaven. All 4 of these books could be read at any point. So if you wanted to dabble between the fantasy and the Sarantine world and just insert these somewhere in there, you could certainly do so. Of the 4 outliers, A Song for Arbonne is probably another great starting point. So let's talk about starting points as we just look at the overview of the books, kind of zoom back and look at what we have here. So where to start? I think if you see the two that I've highlighted, I think the two best starting points are The Lines of Al Rassan, which is in the Sarantine world kind of subcategory, and A Song for Our Bond, which is one of the outliers. I think those are two of the best places to start Guy Gavriel Kay's books. Now I'm going to give you a short list. If I were to just read 4 books or recommend 4 books by Kay, the 4 that I would recommend would be A Song for Our Bond and The Outliers, and then the first 3 up there in the Sarantine world, Lines of Al Rassan and the 2 books of the Sarantine Mosaic. I think that would give you a very nice, short, concise list, and frankly, this is some of Kay's best works, these 4 books here. Now, if I were to give you one more list, just an 8-book list, I would add to that a couple more outliers. I would add Under Heaven, which is fantastic. I would add Tigana, and then 2 of the kind of quasi-Italian trilogy books, Children of Earth and Sky and A Brightness Long Ago. But of course, as I mentioned in the Sarantine World section here, I would read Brightness before Children of Earth and Sky. So that's just a short list of 8 books, but I love all of these books. I would recommend reading all 16 of them. This is an author that I love, an author that I will continue to read and reread as long as I can. So that's my reading advice for the works of Guy Gavriel Kay. I'm going to do one more wrap-up video that I'm really excited to do. I've tagged 2 channels below, Library Ladder and Jake Bishop, because those were the 2 channels that guided me through my Kay journey the most, those 2 guys that run those channels. And I'm going to do a collaboration with them where we put our heads together and come up with a definitive ranking, or at least a 3-headed definitive ranking of the works of Guy Gavriel Kay. But if you want some more Kay content before that video comes out sometime next month, go check out both of their channels. In particular, on Bridger's channel, on Library Ladder, there's a great video about why Guy Gavriel Kay may be the greatest living fantasy author. And then Jake Bishop has a great video where he doesn't just give you, like I did in this video, 2 entry points into Kay's works. He talks about how each book could be an entry point and whether it would be a good entry point or not. So he goes into a little bit more detail and a little bit more depth in that video, so I highly recommend that video as well. But look for that collaboration with Jake and Bridger sometime next month. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.